Cuban and Russian troops were protecting American oil workers from an American-backed rebel movement. The whole Cold War has turned completely upside down. And I just always felt that Angola, in every aspect, reflected that. There was a sort of insanity about the wealth on one end and the poverty the other. And I thought this country cannot possibly survive. This regime is just, it's just impossible. It's Alice in Wonderland. But it has survived, and prospered in a way, and sees itself as quite a big player in Africa. But it's, I think because it's Portuguese speaking, it's often much neglected. So I think this book's going to show great light on where Angola has come from and where it's going. So, I mean, I'll start by just asking Ricardo to give a presentation, and then he'll be followed by Professor Chris Clapham here on my left.
Chris with us both places.
Chris, sorry, wrong one. And Chris Cramer. Sorry, I'm just. My apologies. And then Lara Pawson, who also launched a book here on Angola last year. And Gika Tetembwa, who was in the audience at that time, but this time will be on the panel. So our representative of the young Angola. So, Ricardo.
Thank you, Richard. And let me start by thanking you and the Royal African Society for the invitation to be here today. I'm very, very happy to be here and to be able to share with you my book, which is the fruit of the last 4 years of field work, of thinking, of engaging with the Angolan situation. I'm also very happy to see such familiar faces and such supportive faces, friends and colleagues in the audience who've been accompanying this process over the last few years, the writing of this book. Let me just say that the Angola that I started with was the Angola that Richard briefly hinted at. The Angola that suffered a war that lasted 41 years, from 1961 to 2002, in different guises. The anti-colonial war, the Cold War proxy conflict, the oil and diamonds war of the 1990s, however mislabeled that might have been. The war that killed about 1 million Angolans and which left an estimated 80% of its territory outside government control for the first 27 years of Angolan independence. This was the goal of the Angola that I was first acquainted with. The Angola of foreign mercenaries, the Angola of oil enclaves protected by security companies in this bizarre Cold War game that Richard hinted at. So the Angola that started to pan out very quickly after the end of the war in 2002, and namely after 2004 for reasons that I will explain, very quickly became clear that this was a very different Angola. Just to give you some numbers that are very unsettling. By now, Angola is the third largest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. It's 3 times larger than the Kenyan economy. Angola's GDP in 2002, at the end of the war, was $12 billion. By 2013, it was $121 billion. The government budget in Angola for every year since 2006 has been larger than total OECD aid to Africa as a whole. These are just absolutely spectacular numbers. Angola has become the largest trading partner of China on the continent. It has become the second largest trading partner of the United States, at least until 2013. And obviously, this state, which was deemed and often dismissed as the failed state, as early as the beginning of the 21st century, very quickly became one of the powerhouses of sub-Saharan African politics. I found this story absolutely extraordinary, this shift from failed state to emerging power, at least discursively. And I thought this was an extraordinary but understudied and misunderstood story. So this was the goal that I set myself out to understand, this transformation of Angola since 2002. And in order to understand, and obviously this is a theme that speaks to all of those who are interested in Angola itself, and I think it's a country well deserving of our intrinsic interest, but it's also a story that chimes with many of the themes of the last 10 years. The Africa rising dynamic, the increasing interest that has been given to the political economy of natural resources and how resource-rich states manage the endowments that they have. And other major themes in global politics, obviously the rise of China in Africa. Angola is a remarkable laboratory for looking at these questions in that wider context. But in order to understand the Angolan trajectory, we have to start in 2002, at the end of the war, and we have to understand what happened then and what the conditions were that allowed for this hegemonic project, for this project that empowered the government of Angola to a remarkable extent to even be politically possible. And the most important condition for that was the outright victory of the MPLA government over UNITA. What you had in Angola was not a peace process, you didn't have a power sharing agreement, you didn't have the UN coming over and trying to patch things up as it did and failed to do in the 1990s in Angola and elsewhere. What you had is a fairly classical destruction of the enemy and a degree of power on the side of the government that has very few precedents in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 50 years. If you add to that hegemony, to the fact that the government was finally able to control the whole of Angola in strictly uncompromising terms, to two other factors. One is the exponential increase in the oil price, and the other one is the construction of new partnerships with the likes of China. Then you have the ingredients that allowed the Angolan government a huge amount of autonomy for the usual external pressures that hem in and limit the space of maneuver of most African governments trying to reconstruct themselves after a very, very long conflict. And the jump in oil prices is very significant indeed. Again, an example, I hinted at that when I mentioned the GDP numbers, but I think in 1999, in January 1999, we had the oil barrel at about $9 to $10 a barrel. By 2008, it was $147 a barrel. The Angolans were producing about 800,000 barrels of oil in the late 1990s. By 2008, they were producing almost 2 million barrels. So this led to a boom without precedent in Angolan history, to resources being made available to this victorious government in 2002, and especially after 2004, that were really the stuff that dreams are made of. The sort of resources that allow you to reconfigure both space and state-society relations in a way that most regimes never get to. The point about China, obviously enough, is important. The Chinese came in 2004, after 2 years during which Westerners, uncharacteristically for Western powers that had had always a realpolitik engagement with Angola, even during the war, based on Angola's oil and on the commercial opportunity that Angola constituted. What happened from 2002 to 2004, you had some NGOs like Global Witness, the Open Society Institute, becoming very influential in the setting of policy towards Angola, and in fact lobbying some governments in the West to make aid for post-war reconstruction in Angola dependent on a series of reforms, especially in the area of transparency in the oil sector. Well, by 2004, the government no longer had to contemplate those reforms, which wasn't seriously contemplating anyway, because China made available about $20 billion in credit lines cumulatively over 5 years until 2009, that again, in addition to the oil monies, allowed the Angolans to define their own reconstruction agenda. And how does that reconstruction agenda look like? Well, it's important to understand that the emphasis here is first and foremost on infrastructure. Angola has experienced over the last decade the most capital-intensive process of reconstruction anywhere in the world over the last decades. Really, I can't think of much happening since the end of very large-scale warfare in Europe and in Japan that amounts, obviously in relative terms, to the same amount of commitment. About $60 billion have been spent in national reconstruction in Angola, mostly in national infrastructure, roads, rebuilding, etc. So the first point to note here is that there's a strong focus on hardware rather than software, a strong focus on the built environment of modernity rather than a lot of investment on human capacities or on social expenditure. But this is not just about reconstructing what had been destroyed during the war. It's also about recasting cityscapes. It's about reinventing the new Angola around the image of modernity that the elite, and in particular the MPLA and the people around the president, José Eduardo Santos, think that Angola should be in the 21st century. So in the case of Luanda, this has entailed the wholesale destruction of old Luanda and the rebuilding, and this is not my analogy, this is a comparison that recurs in Luanda, the building of an African Dubai. So if you see the sort of skyline of Luanda over the last 7 or 8 years, you have skyscrapers, you have Copacabana-style avenues and sort of ring roads. You have a construction of a generic global environment of consumerism and of prosperity, meant obviously not for all Angolans, but for the chosen few, which is really a very important part, certainly for the regime, a very important part of its reinvention of post-war Angola. The second aspect of this reconstruction is that the government after 2002-2003 is discursively, it's committing itself to national integration, to broad-based prosperity. So it's absolutely flawless. There is nothing objectionable in the way the regime speaks about reconstruction and about who's at the target of that reconstruction process. All Angolans are. But in reality, what you have, and you can measure that quite strictly in terms of social expenditure or lack of social expenditure, what you have is an alternative political project. The government is not trying to alleviate poverty, it's not trying to create opportunities for all Angolans, it's focusing primarily on what the government, or rather the MPLA itself, calls the national bourgeoisie. In other words, a constituency of some hundreds of thousands of mostly urban Angolans, who are mostly civil servants but also belong to the armed forces, the fledgling private sector in the capital city, and those are the people who the regime has chosen to become a new Angola, if you will, to embody the values of a bourgeoisie, which from the point of view of the ruling party, Angola had not historically had, and certainly not had during the colonial period, where the Angolan bourgeoisie were the white settlers, and therefore it was just absent. Of course, we can dismiss this agenda as agenda concentrating the benefits of reconstruction on the few, but it's important, if you're trying to analyze this process internally, to understand that there's an internal coherence to this agenda, and this agenda is fundamentally about creating a critical mass of prosperous Angolans around the elite and around the ruling party. But the way this pans out in terms of social expenditure is quite uneven, and in fact it's quite an outlier experience, even in terms of the average sub-Saharan African experience. So for instance, over the last 10 years, in most years we've had about 3 times as much investment in the military and the security sector as you've had in education, and about 4 times as much investment in the military and security sector as you've had in the health sector. And obviously this expenditure is itself remarkably concentrated in the urban environment, to the detriment of the shanty towns, and most importantly to the detriment of the countryside. But around this national bourgeoisie, which has expanded, there is now a critical mass of urban middle-class Angolans who have a better life than they would have had 10 years ago. What you have at the core of that experience is an oligarchy, a small number of beneficiaries of the opportunities of reconstruction. It's very important to see this in continuity with the experience of the 1990s. There was plenty of profiteering, plenty of war opportunities, which Cramer has charted quite meticulously. What you've had under this political economy of war is that the people who benefited from the war were also extraordinarily well placed to benefit from the peace. And the peace opportunities, the opportunities of national reconstruction, were disproportionately refracted through the interests of this elite constituency, which has grown fabulously rich in the last 10 years, and which has become an elite which is extremely internationalized. One of the ironies of the Angolan decade of reconstruction is the extent to which Angola has become one of the leading, if not the leading, foreign direct investor in Portugal, and has in fact bought large chunks of the Portuguese economy since Portugal entered in recession in late 2008 or 2009. So it's very important when, as social scientists, if we're looking at this from a very impersonal perspective of social change, it's very important to understand that at the center of this process of reconstruction. There was a small, discernible clique of individuals, a few hundred families, that have had a disproportionate amount of benefits accruing from this experience of national reconstruction. What is the goal, therefore, of this experience of national reconstruction? The goal, I think, should be defined in retrospect, but in fact, you can find party documents that are more or less explicit in this regard, and certainly in my book you'll find plenty of information, interviews that are very consensual in this regard. The rule is to cement the MPLA's, the ruling party's domination for the next generation, and to create and consolidate a constituency of Angolans around that experience. And also, most importantly, if you will, to redefine the nation in the image of the party. It's very important for you to look at 20th century Angolan history and to understand that what Angola is, what Angola should be, has been the subject of heavy contestation from the 1950s until 2002. It wasn't just oil and diamonds. It wasn't just, cynical Cold War politics. There were internal roots to the conflict, and those internal roots were about what sort of Angola one should create. Should it be an Angola that is more, if you will, in Nita's language, Afrocentric? Should it be an Angola that is more Creole and coastal and Portuguese speaking? That debate was decided in 2002. And the MPLA was able, at least for one short hegemonic decade, to try to define the country in its own image. And in that regard, it's very important to understand the role of outsiders in this process, because the fact that Angola has been capable, or rather the Angolan elite has been capable of carving out the space of autonomy for themselves in national reconstruction, doesn't mean that they pursue this effort without a foreign involvement in it. In fact, Angola has been flushed with about 500,000 expats, and this is one of the most striking images of the decade of reconstruction, is the fact that up to 200,000 Portuguese have returned to Angola, probably about 70 to 80,000 Brazilians, perhaps 250,000 Chinese, hundreds of thousands of other Africans whose numbers are entirely unaccounted for, Congolese, Malian, Senegalese. It's an alphabet soup of foreigners presiding over this effort of national reconstruction. And most importantly, although the Chinese role has been emphasized in the literature, the role of the Portuguese, the Brazilians, but of Westerners more generally is equally important. And one of the ironies of Angolan reconstruction is the extent to which formerly critical foreign powers, such as most of the European and North American countries, have actually made a peace with the Angolan elite once the Angolan elite opened the country up for foreign direct investment and made itself much more appealing, created a financial sector of sorts, and made itself much more appealing to some forms of direct investment, how the normative emphasis, the criticisms of human rights governance disappeared from the picture, including Scandinavian states that are normally known for their emphasis on human rights. They became extraordinarily close to the Angolan regime, and the Angolan regime was able to shift the status that was this near pariah status 10 years ago or so to a very comfortable and respectable status in the international community, not just in the region, but more generally. However, part of the book charts all of these developments, and also the internal politics of these developments inside the MPLA, but also in Angolan society more generally. And it comes to a dispiriting conclusion in about 2012. And that conclusion is fairly straightforward. In a move that is not untypical of post-war societies, most Angolans in 2002 were simply happy to be alive. They had been experiencing war for more than 4 decades. They finally had no one shooting at them, and they were finally able to engage in their private lives, rebuild their private lives, and go back to their homes for the 4 million Angolans who were internally displaced and the 1 million Angolans that were abroad. So for 1 long decade, the regime was able to shape Angola as it saw fit, with minimal pushback on the side of the population. From about 2012 onwards, that started to change very quickly. And I'll outline for the remainder of my 5 minutes presentation, I'll outline the 3 factors which I think are really, really important about the shifts that have happened in Angola in the last 3 years. Not just important, but extremely worrying for the country in the coming years. The first and most important dynamic is that Angolan society is reawakening. Anywhere between 68 and 73% of Angolans now are below the age of 25. For them, the war has the same meaning as the Second World War has for me. It's an historical event. Their parents, or indeed anyone who's above 40 years old, will compare their present situation with the situation they experienced during the war. And even if they're critical of the status quo, the comparison is always positive. For the young people, however, what they compare is their current plight with the consumerist, very Brazilian culture of luxury, of ostentation that they get through the Angolan media, which over the last 10 years has gone from sort of being a Soviet-style, fairly grayish and not very exhibitionist media culture to being one of the most unrestrained cultures of luxury and ostentation, which is fed live into the houses of many Angolans who now have television, even in the shelter towns and in some parts of the countryside. This is having a remarkable impact in the expectations of young people in Angola. This is partly the government to blame, because the government has spent the last 10 years not providing Angolans with a minimalist, low expectation approach, but it has been the Angolan state itself that has presented itself as a hyper-developmentalist state, as a state that was going to redeem Angolan poverty, that it was going to turn Angola into a first world country in a generation or so. So those expectations have been fully imbibed by the Angolan population, and now a reckoning is taking place. This point about youth mobilization is part of a general reawakening of Angolan society. That doesn't mean regime change or any sort of threat to the status quo, but it means that the status quo is now operating in a context where its social legitimacy is really eroding very, very fast. The second point is the fact that very central to this national reconstruction agenda, to this idea that Angola was going to become a successful powerhouse of the 21st century, over the last 10 years, which you can find strewn across all sorts of documentation, state, government, single ruling party, etc., is the idea that Angola was diversifying its economy, that Angola was both industrializing and expanding its agribusiness. In fact, by 2014, 95% of Angolan exports still came from the oil sector, making Angola not a petrostate, but a caricature of a petrostate. It's not that oil is the biggest game in town, it's practically the only game in town. And everything else, including construction and non-oil sectors, are entirely dependent on the oil price. These issues have not only not been addressed, but over the last 6 months with the precipitous drop in the oil price, again, the whole Angolan developmental model is undergoing a very, very deep crisis. The third point that is probably on the minds of those of you who are interested in Angolan politics is the crisis of succession. President dos Santos, who's the mastermind of pretty much everything, it's the first or second time in this presentation that I mentioned him, and yet he's really the mastermind of pretty much everything that I've described. He's been in power since 1979. He's a meticulous micromanager. He runs the country in a really meticulous and very, 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 very tight manner. So his demise is likely to be as traumatic for the country as you would expect it to be. In other words, President dos Santos has, the fact that he has concentrated decision-making at the presidency over the last 30 years or so has had some positive benefits. For instance, the Angolan oil sector has been managed with coherence and with a long-term agenda that is lacking, for instance, in places like Nigeria, where decision-making is far, far less concentrated. But I think the negative aspects of his rule will predominate as time goes by. And in particular, President dos Santos has deinstitutionalized power in Angola. Ministries don't matter, institutions don't matter, the parliament is not very important in decision-making, and a coterie of advisors around the president really take most of the important decisions, if not all the important decisions in the country. Now, what happens next is anyone's guess. President Santos is said to be contemplating his own secession for the last 15 years or so. But it's unlikely to happen in a constructive manner. I think a lot of people are putting attention on the mechanics, the immediate context of transition. Most of my interviews point to the fact that at the MPLA level, most barons in the party are rational enough. They have a lot of things at stake, their own personal interests at stake. They're rational enough to operate this transition in a peaceful manner in a very short term, but that will be the first day of the rest of the life of Angola. In other words, how will the next incumbent rule the country through institutions that were built for this president, and how will he be able to keep the ruling party and very disparate interests in that ruling party together? That is a question that will make Angola's politics in the next 10 years extraordinarily complicated, but extraordinarily interesting.